It's way past time I dispense some indiscriminate justice!
Without understatement, if battlecruisers are the cherry on the Terran cake, siege tanks are fudge, or a biscuit, or a souffle. In general, call it whatever you want. But no Terran battle is complete without these beauties. Maybe only fighting in outer space. Although, hey Arcturus, how was it in 2491? Siege tanks have always been the foundation of both defensive and offensive strategies, and 120-180mm cannons solved all the problems. Without noise and dust? No. Conversely, loud and pretentious, with maximum destruction. Fans of big bada-booms were delighted. The history of the appearance and development of this military equipment is very interesting, and the combat characteristics are impressive. So brew coffee, take a comfortable position on the couch and enjoy. StarCraft is calling. Everybody knows tanks, an armored combat vehicle on a caterpillar track, as a rule with a full rotation turret, including a cannon and machine gun armament as additional equipment. A feature of the siege tanks is precisely the ability to switch to siege mode. The deployment of such an artillery mount, the hurricane power of which could level entire outposts and enemy bunkers with the ground. Moreover, initially the idea was precisely in the manufacture of the artillery piece, the so-called final defense cannon, which was supposed to remain static in the special position and serve exclusively for defensive purposes. Initially this seemed to be enough, but military conflicts showed the failure of such construction. More precisely, the gun itself was very effective, but it couldn't get away from a reciprocal enemy attack, as it was unable to carry out fire support during an offensive or counterattack. As it's not surprising, what we today call siege tanks owes its appearance to the Goliaths. Yes. As you remember, the first versions of the Goliaths were developed by the Larscope Technologies by order of the Kelmorian Combine, and they were actively used by the later back in 2480. The development of the concept of a dual-mode siege tank was the response of the Terran Confederacy to the Kelmorian novelty. The deadlines were running out, so the engineers had to quickly make the cannon, which had already proven itself mobile. But it should not be just a mobile installation, since it is still vulnerable until the moment of deployment, but a full-fledged combat vehicle capable of firing under any conditions and at any time, without sacrificing mobility, even on the go, even standing. Tanks already existed in the Confederate army, and to reduce time and cost, it was decided to change the existing design of the tank so that it could work like a conventional tank, and if necessary, be able to deploy a cannon, becoming a stationary artillery emplacement. The first basic versions appeared all the same in 2480. Although at the time they were rather hastily assembled prototypes, not yet sufficiently brought to mind and running. Only during the Guild Wars from 2485 to 2489 they began to play in full glory. The presence of dual-mode tanks with terrifying firepower in the camp of the Confederacy made it possible more than once to tip the scales in their favor. They were extremely effective on the battlefield. In Assault or Classic Tank mode, it was an excellent armored support unit with good protection, good speed and sufficient maneuverability, which coupled with strong weapons worked wonders. The real hell came when the tank turned to the siege mode and transformed into a full-fledged artillery cannon, increasing both firepower and the radius of destruction of targets at times. It was very difficult to get close to such equipment from the ground. Aviation remained the most effective option. Unfortunately, the technical characteristic of those basic models of siege tanks, including the caliber of guns, the radius of destruction, driving performance, etc., have not been preserved. But there is no need to grieve, because by the period of 2491 new models of tanks under the brand name AAV-5 Arclite came into use. Arclite brought not evolutionary but rather revolutionary changes, and first of all they were concerned with the convenience of driving the machine, as well as the addition of an abundance of modifications, which significantly increased the versatility of the tank. The Arclite was the backbone of Terran fire support during the First Great War. The armor of the combat vehicle included several layers of neo-steel reaching a total thickness of 15 centimeters. The tank crew consisted of 3 people: driver, gunner and commander or navigator. The personal combat experience required for enlistment varied by position. But if we draw parallels with other combat units, for example, the same Goliath, then most likely it is also at least 6 months. In other matters, the tank was not always controlled by a full crew. Very often there was only one pilot, due to the lack of people. So to speak, a master of all trades. He led, laid the road and fired from the guns. For example, such skills were demonstrated by the notorious Forest Kill, one of the associates of Mengsk and a member of the Sons of Korhal. It was he who in 2491 fired from the docking compartment of the Hyperion battlecruiser Nora II under the command of Edmund Duke. By the way, the tightness of the cabin of the Arclite was significantly improved, which made it possible to use tanks even on space platforms. This was also facilitated by the gravity accelerators, which had several modes of operation. In addition, the tank could serve as a kind of armored personnel carrier, delivering personnel to hotspot and releasing people through the side or rear hatches. Comfort for passengers there did not smell, but in war, as in war, comfort is the last thing on your mind. To make matters worse, it was quite hot in the cockpit, and when there are a lot of people, it is very stuffy. The air conditioning system didn't always work effectively. Meanwhile, it is worth highlighting the excellent work of the hydraulic actuators of the undercarriage of the tank, which can compensate for a significant part of the shock wave in the event of a tangent hit, or in the immediate vicinity of the tank while maintaining the stability of the combat vehicle, even including in the presence of deep ruts, pits, potholes and other irregularities relief. And the gyroscopes installed on the Arclite make it possible to overcome slopes and ledges with inclines of up to 65 degrees. In fact, these are very extreme figures, especially for a heavily armored tank. Almost fantastic. And yes, they don't come easy. The machine is in overload, but nevertheless, it is possible. And in the field, tanker Marius Blackwood proved this during a military operation against the Protoss forces on Moria in 2505. The transmission includes a manual gearbox, which allows the driver to fully control the process of movement and emergency braking of the tank. The system is quite simple, but in most cases trouble-free. During emergency braking, as well as for fixing tanks in the cargo compartments of spaceships, magnetic interlocks mounted on tracks are used. As for the navigation, diagnostic scanning and target acquisition system, they are represented by numerous sensors and screens that provided the operator with all necessary information about the state of the machine and about nearby objects, including hostile ones. The tank had an internal viewing screen, although sometimes crew members climbed out through the top hatch for a better visual inspection of the area or to manually signal fellow marines if necessary. The onboard computer was closely connected to the targeting system, which was guided not only by visual data, but also tuned to the thermal trace of the hostile object. This made it possible to fix the target even in condition of poor visibility. The system perfectly determined the distance to the target, took into account the error in bad weather conditions, and if the target came or, on the contrary, left the zone of destruction of the cannons, it informed with appropriate sound and visual signals. The Arclite diagnostic screen provided complete information about the state of the combat vehicle. In the event of something malfunctioning, the computer through the holographic image signaled which element was out of order. whether it be tracks, a cannon barrel, transmission or hydraulic outriggers. The navigation system made it easy to plot routes, use all the possibilities of tracking your own positioning, and also provided a three-dimensional topographic map of the area. The armament of the AAV-5 Arclite is represented by two twin 80mm PPG-7 plasma cannons, which operate when the tank is in assault mode, as well as a 120mm shock cannon deployed in siege mode. Plasma weapons are very effective against large combat units, primarily ground vehicles. However, no one forbids using them to shoot the same marines. Simply in such cases it will be less rational regarding ammunition consumption and the speed of eliminating targets. In this case it is much easier to shoot the infantry with the cannons of the same Goliath. In general, plasma weapons even made it possible to penetrate the armor of protoss stalkers, of course after their plasma shields were depleted. In general, the PPG-7 cannons coped well with the fire support of the infantry on the battlefield. Problems came when it was necessary to move on to storming enemy bases, besieging cities, outposts or resisting extremely heavily armored enemy units. But in this case, the Arclite had a siege mode in store, which perfectly copes with the tasks. The 120mm shock cannon perfectly annihilated even the most powerful ground equipment of the enemy, not to mention bunkers, barriers, industrial buildings, etc. A little later it was further upgraded and was named Mjolnir, in honor of the famous hammer of the Scandinavian god of thunder, Thor. The caliber remained the same, but the firepower, the momentum imparted to the projectile, and accordingly the scale of destruction increased. The only point is that in the siege mode the tank has so-called minimum radius of destruction. It becomes extremely vulnerable to mobile combat units, for example the same zerglings or zealots. Therefore tank units are always accompanied by infantry or aircraft, or the tanks themselves are placed behind the bunkers where they will always be covered. And they in turn play an excellent role of the same final defense system, for which they once thought. In technical terms, the Arclite was quite advanced for its time, and some operators became so entrenched with their machine that they were reluctant to upgrade to more modern Crucios even after the later had become the de facto standard of the Terran military. But time, as they say, spares no one, and after the events of the Brood War, the military command of the Dominion concluded that the technical characteristics of the assault mode of the Arclite leave much to be desired. Its weapons and armor seemed to lie in implementing both the offensive and holding the defense. First of all, it concerned the zerg, which was so many. Their claws, fangs and spikes easily pierced even the toughest Terran armor, and the actual technical characteristics of the Arclite at the time of its design and development were not calculated on such enemy. In order to hold the lines, it was often necessary to resort to significant third-party support, which led to the dispersal of troops and unnecessary death. As a result, a new version of the siege tank called the Crucio was developed to eliminate all of the above shortcomings. The new model was put into operation in 2502. Compared to the Arclite, the strength of the tank was significantly increased by increasing and strengthening the turret and hull. In addition, the turret now has an improved projectile loadout designed for tank combat, allowing the Crucio to better defend in open battle even if the enemy gets close enough. The cost of the new model is higher than that of its predecessor, but the price was justified by improved versatility, which is exactly what the engineers were trying to achieve. Now the already versatile siege tanks has come even more versatile. The chassis has also been significantly improved. The treads of the armored vehicle are made of modular heavy-duty neo-steel plates. In addition, the Crucio has a multi-track configuration with 2 extra tracks on the sides for increased cross-country ability. Historically tracked vehicles have a disadvantage, as the loss of a single tread segment results in the immobilization of the entire tank. To prevent this, the engineers have added a special system to the chassis design, consisting of many tubes and hoses through which a quickly hardening gel is applied to the damaged track section. Said gel replaces lost thread segments and allows the Crucio to remain operational even after a direct hit on the chassis. In Siege mode, the main tracks of the tank turn outwards, while the secondary tracks slide into the hull. Powerful hydraulic outriggers, often called legs, deploy from the sides of the Crucio. Once the legs are fixed, they are pressed to the ground, providing additional stability. The feet of the outriggers are equipped with notches that activate on rough terrain, and microscopic whip holes, through which a rubbery substance is supplied to fix it on metal surfaces and pavement. Hydraulic supports can be relied upon, but sometimes they get stuck. This is Crucio's Achilles heel. In total, the mass of the tank is about 60 tons. As in the case of the Arclite, the heat in the tank's cockpit remained a problematic topic. To compensate for this, the engineers equipped the Crucio with a set of powerful compressors that pump air and regulate the temperature in the cabin. However, all this works due to the machine's engine's power. Moreover, in some cases this expense is huge. Therefore, some experienced tank drivers, as well as desperate beginners, prefer to modify the climate control system, increasing the overall engine power while sacrificing comfort.
Need something blown up?
As for weapons, changes are also noticeable here, but the basic paradigm remains the same. The Crucio's turret, like the Arclites, has a dual mod system. In the assault tank mode, twin 90mm plasma cannons are used. Yes, the caliber has grown up. These are the main, one might say, Crucio's line of defense, and are effective against enemy armored vehicles. However, the tank's true power is shown in its siege mode. Did you think the 120mm Mjolnir was a fiend of hell? Forget. What about the new 180mm siege cannon that fires superheated tungsten shells? Well, is it worth saying that the destruction radius of this baby is my respect? Few adversaries will be able to respond at least something against such a hurricane of power. The roar of this cannon sends the enemies of the Dominion in full retreat. Generally, it shoots further, the shells are more powerful and the craters are larger. What else do you need? Oh yes, as for the craters. Since the area of destruction from the explosion's epicenter has increased significantly, the headache of the Dominion command was that too many of their soldiers began to die from the so-called friendly fire. As a result, it grew into a such global problem that the engineers were tasked with developing some kind of smart shell that could have a friend of foe system.
Why don't you walk about 30 yards out and stand still for me?
As they say, there is a demand, there will be an offer. The guys from the Larscope Technologies by 2504 presented their versions of smart shells for siege tanks, which scan the area and, in case of detection of friendly units, minimize the damage caused to them. Combat testing showed that Allied casualties were reduced by as much as 75%. The figure is impressive, but it still doesn't give a 100% guarantee. Therefore, the soldiers are still urged to be careful in the shelling zones. And of course, I am even afraid to imagine how much such shells cost. After all, most likely to identify friend or foe, there is some kind of electronics, perhaps a microcomputer. And it not only determines where to hit, but also calculates how to hit, adjusting the level of detonation and the direction of the possible divergence of the shock wave. But not a single tungsten or smart ammunition is rich in the arsenal of the new Crucios. To increase penetration, the artillery cannon can be equipped with maelstrom rounds. These are armor-piercing shells. The power of the blast wave remains the same, but with the direct hit of the target, additional damage is dealt. Around 2508, the Crucio tanks could be equipped with spider mines. In particular, during the Defenders of Man insurgency, special forces under the command of Nova Terra, namely tank units, were equipped with such mines. Technical updates. Both the Arclite and the Crucio have been constantly updated throughout their history. Clever masters tweaked something, then replaced it, and you see the tank became stronger and more deadly. The main upgrades were carried out by engineers in the armories, namely upgrade vehicle weapons and upgrade vehicle plating. The latter made it possible to significantly increase the combat life of the tank. Of course, there were more upgrades on the Crucio than on the Arclite, so by 2504 the tanks acquired vanadium plating, which further increased the strength of the armor by 5%, as well as ultra-capacitors, which increased the attack speed by the same 5%. It seems to be a little, but in the battles it was felt. Thanks to the developments of Egon Statman in the field of the nanotechnology, a material such as regenerative biosteel was created. This research was prompted by his study of the zerg tissues. The amazing ability to regenerate seemed to Egon very useful, and he decided to introduce something similar to Terran technology. As a result, the Crucio tanks, which are at the disposal of Jim Raynor, have acquired such a useful feature. By 2506, Rory Swan had upgraded vehicles of Raynor's raiders additionally. In the battle with Aemon, all forces were acquired. Therefore, the advanced optics were added to the existing improvements and increased the attack range of tanks. The Immortality Protocol, a technology that, as in the case of Thor's, allowed siege tanks to self-repair after almost complete destruction. And finally, mechanical know-how increased the durability of equipment by 20%, thanks to Rory's subtle instincts and little secrets that Swan never liked to share. Jim himself really liked the upgrades associated with reducing the transformation time into siege mode and back, as well as increased armor durability. Afterburners, which temporarily increased the movement speed of vehicles by 100%, very often helped out in the most difficult situations, when it needed to catch up the enemy quickly or vice versa get away. Well, mercenary munitions allowed to increase attack speed by 15%. By 2508, complementary mods were bolted to the tanks. In addition to the aforementioned spider mines, regenerative biosteel and smart service that allowed the tank to transform between modes 4 times faster, the Crucio was also equipped with jump jets. That's really an interesting design solution. Now the tanks were able to overcome any ledges without any problems. It was easy to change the place of deployment, and this worked both in the assault and siege mods. During the Defenders of Man insurgency, the fighters under Nova Terra's leadership took full advantage of this new technology. After a successful campaign against the forces of the Merbius Foundation in 2506 at the secret research station, Carolina Davis herself received access not only to a secret weapon called the Balios, but also to developments in the field of creating clocking devices for Thors and siege tanks. Later, during the assault on the residence of General Davis, Nova discovered tanks capable of dissolving in the air in the manner that she herself did, thanks to the special ghost suit. Initially, when deploying a military base, in addition to building the factory to manufacture vehicles, a special extension was often required, where engineers carried out additional calculations and calibration. In particular, the transformation mode for siege tanks was finalized there, preliminary tests were carried out, etc. In the case of the Arclite, these extensions were the machine shops, which special technical laboratories had replaced by the time the Crucio tanks appeared. So, one brainy engineer named Redel Quinton from Project Blackstone concluded that in the military buildings of the Dominion, latrines, their toilets, if not a luxury, then clearly an extra element. Marines can urinate in CMC armor. They have a recycling system for this. Well, some individual scientists or engineers can relieve themselves outside the complex. In particular, he came up with the idea that the freed up space in the case of factories could be reserved for siege devices. Then the tanks will leave factories with full equipment, and there will be no need to investigate and calibrate anything in the tech lab additionally. I don't know what size toilets they have there that can place siege weapons, but along the way, Redell's initiative interested someone in the military circles of the Dominion, because later the tanks really left the factories initially ready to work in siege mode. Now let's talk about variants. Mostly they are all modified versions of the Crucio in one way or another. This model proved to be excellent during the Second Great War, so Terrans were not going to develop anything radically new yet. For example, Tyrador 9 used siege tanks with platinum alloy armor. They were costly and primarily pursued decorative purposes. High-ranking guests of Tyrador were greeted with 10 cannon volleys. The armor was additionally polished to a shine, to produce an even greater effect. Mira Han's Marauders were also very fond of playing around with tanks. If you look at them, you won't immediately understand that these are the good old Crucios. Spikes, blades and other stuff like in the Mad Max universe. What can I say? This technique is quite suitable to amuse the criminal public. And what a clank of caterpillar tracks when something needs to be crushed, you will never forget this sound. In other matters, these tanks go no worse for ramming. Mira did a great job. The so-called commanders and other mercenaries crept up close to Mira's Marauders, but as for me, not enough. They are also obsessed with rebuilding engines, modifying cannons, improving chassis, controls, etc. And of course giving their cars a frightening look. Well, maybe in technical terms they succeeded, but in visual terms they are clearly inferior to Mira. There was also a separate category of mercenary tankers called Siege Breakers, whom Graven Hill introduced to Raynor. What can I say about these guys? They spent their past life in the service of the Confederacy. Then they went all out, but they know their business perfectly, and they feel the 60-ton neosteel under their asses. These guys are one with their cars. And all the problems are ready to be solved with one volley of artillery pieces. Most importantly, keep your wallet ready. Technically, their elite tanks' armor are 1/3 stronger than the classic Crucios, and their weapons are 2/3 more powerful. Notably, the Siege Breakers did not abandon Raynor's raiders even in the most desperate moments, and supported the military campaigns both on Korhal and against the forces of Aemon, up to including the expedition into the Void. Arcturus Mengsk Royal Guard used a modified Crucio called the Shock Division. This is a heavy siege tank, which when deployed turned into long-range artillery. The main feature of Mengsk elite troops was that the Emperor managed to make very good friends between his Medivacs, which were called Imperial Intercessor, with Shock Division tanks. When transporting the latter in siege mode, the tank was attached to the bottom of the Medivac dropship and rose to any height, from which it could easily carry out shelling even of enemy air forces. I think this is another Arcturus reference to the events of 2491. In addition, these combat vehicles were equipped with smart servos, which greatly accelerated the transformation into siege mode and back. The so-called shock and awe technology was designed to amplify the roar and shock wave from tank artillery attacks, as a result of which the cases of shell shock and disorientation of the enemy increased significantly. In addition, work was carried out to improve the optics, and the cannons were additionally calibrated, which led to both an increase in the viewing radius and the actual target engagement radius. Well, as a cherry on the cake, but in fact an excellent addition to the shock and awe, Dominion engineers managed to increase area damage by another 40%. Massive clusters of opponents became even easy to destroy. Shock Division, like other elite units of Mengsk, tried to stop the Queen of Blades invasion of Korhal in 2505. However, all attempts were unsuccessful. Zerg emerged from that meat grinder as favorites, and the Emperor was eliminated. When Valerian Mengsk took the throne, the military command of the Dominion decided to slightly improve the model of the standard Crucio. Reinforced plating and more powerful cannons were added. Well, of course, not all mortals had access to it. First of all, such equipment was supplied to special forces. A special variant of tanks was at the disposal of Nova Terra. Since her specialization is the performance of extremely important tasks at the request of the Emperor himself, then the units accompanying her must be of the best equipment, and heavy siege tanks perfectly cope with this role. As I mentioned earlier, these models made friends with spider mines, so tankers could feel calm even in siege mode, because if the enemy enters the dead zone of the artillery cannon, then the spiders will blow it up there. Also, these combat vehicles boosted and increased radius of destruction in the siege mode up to 2.5 times greater armor strength and 1.5 times more powerful guns. Continuing the theme of Nova, let's move on to infested siege tanks. During her campaign on the planet Charbon Minor, where she was led by Alarak to search for Terrazine, infested Terran vehicles, including siege tanks, were discovered.
Proceed with caution. My scans show infested siege tanks nearby.
As it was established, this was the remains of the emerging expedition. They founded a research station. It is difficult to say what exactly they studied here, but it is unlikely that the flora and the fauna of the planet. Most likely they were also chasing Terrazine. Whatever the case, their position were attacked by the Zerg, and most people were infested with a hyper-evolutionary virus. Extreme mutations resulted in alien flesh literally sticking around Terran vehicles. In the case of tanks, they retained the ability to use 180mm siege weapons, but the functionality of the twin 90mm cannons seems to have been lost. In addition, the tank's chassis was damaged, so it became impossible to move in a classical way. The Zerg army has the so-called spine crawlers. In fact, these are stationary anti-ground defense system for the Zerg, like tanks in siege mode for the Terran or photon cannons for the protoss. They attack only in route condition, but if necessary, they can be redeployed. To do this, they have powerful spider-like paws, let's call it that. Well, in cases with infested tanks, since they cannot go by caterpillar tracks, then they will crawl. In short, the mutation led to the growth of these paws. The technique could attack only in root state. Among the adherents of heavy weapons was the notorious Alexei Stukov. After his body was infested, he could no longer feel like a human. He saw a monster in the mirror. Ultimately, this led to the fact that the new family for the former Vice Admiral was the Zerg. Kerrigan even supported him in this.
Infested, held captive, experimented on and hunted. We have some things in common. I understand. Believe me, stay with the swarm, and perhaps the way will become clear.
If nothing else, it would be interesting.
Well, as part of the swarm, Stukov didn't hesitate to conduct his experiments, as a result of which his army was replenished with an impressive number of infested. Stukov's siege tanks were a hybrid of spine crawlers and the tanks themselves. They moved on their paws, and a huge armor-piercing impeller tentacle protruded from the turret. It was used in assault mode. An artillery cannon was already connected when the tank deployed, or rather, rooted. But the tank fired salvos not with shells, but with infested Terrans. And since the latter contained too many caustic explosives, they were quite suitable as a replacement for classic shells. Moreover, they detonated not at the moment of landing, but precisely upon contact with the target. That is, if the tank misses the target a little, then the infested one, after landing, gets to his feet and independently pursues the victim. Stukov's infested tanks also have one very useful feature, called Deep Tunnel. It allows you to lay an underground passage in any place where there is a creep. It is worth noting that it works including with hostile brutes. Tanks can literally crawl out of the ground right at the enemy base. Comfortable? Undoubtedly. Alexei is very proud of his new toys, and in 2506 he did not stand outside when the entire sector rallied against the hybrids and Amon. Next we will talk about the Mojon Protectorate. We have heard a lot about their superior intelligence service and developed spy network. The appearance of new tanks of the Crucio model could not go unnoticed by the Mojons. And if early it was only possible to guess whether they had such technologies in their arsenal, all doubts dissipated after visiting Jarvan Minor. Those infested tanks that Nova found were exactly the Crucio model. In addition, the Imperial tank was presented by the Protectorate. The Mojons themselves position it as a completely new modern model of a siege tank and a response to the Dominion technique. Even according to the preliminary results of combat tests, the Imperial can seriously compete with the Crucio and in some cases completely overtake it. But looking at the Protectorate tank, it immediately becomes clear where the legs grow from and that almost entirely both the design and characteristics were copied from the Dominion tanks. In the end, I'll say a few words about variations of the good old Arclite. There are not so many. The first is so-called Carnage tank. It belongs to the leader of the mercenaries, Arius Carnage. Probably the modification itself is named after him. In fact, it is an improved Arclite, where armor strength is increased by 33%. More powerful twin PPG-7 plasma cannons are installed, increased damage by the same 33%. And the firepower of the main artillery 120mm Mjolnir cannon is increased by 14%. Arius himself, after the events of Brood War, offered his services to the infested Stukov in capturing Chimeran pirates. The second variation is the Tower Cannon. It was discovered at a secret Confederate research station, where Chimeran pirates infiltrated in search of secret data from the old regime. And this information was so valued on the black market. In fact, the Confederacy almost completely lost its tank corps during the fall of Tersonis. Instead of collecting materials to build new vehicles of the same kind, the leaders of the old Confederacy decided to use a robotic version of the Arclite siege tank. This specially modified tank had no pilot, but could effectively fire at the enemy. In conditions of a catastrophic lack of resources and when every fighter counts, using artificial intelligence is not such a bad idea, at least as a purely defensive unit on the most important objects. However, there are a number of disadvantages. First of all, the armor. It is much weaker than the usual Arclite. The siege weapon also has less damage. Apparently, there was a lack of resources, and besides, this variation of the siege tank is not able to switch to mobile mode. It is static and fully justifies the name. Exactly that a tower cannon. It seems that the remnants of the Confederate forces decided to remember the old days, and just in this model they returned to the very original concept, the stationary final defense cannon, which I mentioned at the beginning of the video. We can talk about tanks endlessly, but time is not rubber, and I see that you are also tired of my chatter. It's time, as they say, an honor to know. We walked through the history, sorted out weapons, structure, models, upgrades, and briefly remembered several famous tankers of the Koprulu sector. Thank you for your attention. Do not forget to rate the material, like or dislike, as you like. And of course, I want once again to thank the sponsors and patrons of the channel. It is thanks to you guys these videos may be released. Well friends, play StarCraft, be sure to play Terrans, and first of all go into siege tanks. Bye everyone and see you soon on the channel.